Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Brown Bag Lunch series presented by the Gender Equity Initiative. Our speaker today is Maria Lynn from Rulon-Miller Books. Maria has been with Rulon-Miller since 2013 after obtaining her master's in library science from the University of Denver and a BA in Asian Studies from the University of Hawaii. Also, Maria was a William Rees Fellow at the Rare Book School in 2017 and currently is a teaching faculty at CAPS, Minnesota. Take it away, Maria.
Hello again. So I'm going to be talking about cataloging books that you can't read. I enjoy cataloging books that I can't read a great deal. It's a bit of a hobby of mine. There's a lot of pitfalls when you're trying to catalog something you can't read, but there are also a lot of opportunities. You learn a lot of cool new things, and nowadays, it's not nearly as difficult as you might think it is. So what I'm going to do is go over my general mindset for why I catalog these books, how I decide to catalog them, and the process that I use to catalog them with some tips and tricks along the way. So first, there are a few sort of fundamental things to keep in mind. These are all things that we keep in mind when we're cataloging any book. They're sort of truisms of the trade. They're just more true for foreign language books. So the first one is that technology is extremely useful, but it still must be mindfully applied. It can get over a lot of humps, but you have to confirm any information that it gives you very carefully. The second is that cataloging foreign language books in batches is usually the most efficient way, and this makes pretty good sense if, for example, you're looking at a collection of books on any topic that you're not familiar with to begin with. Knowing that the time investment up front of becoming familiar with those books is going to be spread across multiple books makes it easier for you to be willing to make that investment. So at Rulon-Miller Books, we've picked up large collections of Armenian books, of Russian books, of Chinese books, and even though no one here can read them, they're worth it because we had more than just a couple of them to deal with. The third one is like the biggest one, in my opinion. Do not even trust, just verify. A lot of times, very erroneous information comes with the books that you may be trying to catalog, and you have to be very careful that this doesn't lead you astray, which we'll talk about quite a bit later. And lastly, there are many book markets, and with international books, it's harder for those markets to interact. Again, this is something we understand in the trade in general. We all have our own particular markets, but with international books, there's very little interaction, and that can mean both, that can have implications both for pricing, but also for the amount of information that interacts between the markets. So if I were giving this talk, say, even 5 years ago, it would probably look a lot different. But technology has advanced significantly within the past 2 or 3 years, especially when it comes to language learning and what we now sometimes call AI, just advanced learning models. And Google Lens is a very good example of this. If you take away a single thing from this talk, it's the fact that Google Lens exists and that it will take away a lot of the work that used to be really, really difficult to do and made cataloging books you can't read seem not worth it. So I'm just going to go into what exactly Google Lens is and what it can do for you. Google Lens is a phone app, so you need to have it installed on your phone. You don't need to have a Google phone. iPhones also will let you use it. I'm sure Windows phones will too. And what you do is you take a picture of your book and you let Google scan it. And what Google does is it lets you either provide a full text copy, you can search for the text, and you can translate the text through the program. It does a very good job on pretty much all Western language books, German, Spanish, French, and so on and so forth. You can see here, with a push of a button, it basically translates this to a degree where we kind of know what we're looking at now, right? It doesn't just work on Latin alphabets. This is Russian, no problem here. You can see that it also makes an attempt at transcribing the name on the cover, the owner's signature. And it's not great with handwritten stuff, but it does give it a really good shot. I mean, this is longhand, and it still has made a pretty good guess. With slightly rarer or maybe more difficult fonts, this is Armenian, and it's written in a font that is not common. This is not typically how you would see Armenian, say, on the web nowadays, but Google is still capable of identifying it, capable of transcribing it. And again, you need to confirm that what it thinks it's looking at is exactly what it's looking at. These are success stories. There are failures at times. And it also manages to translate the text. And you can see that this is not, a perfect and comprehensive English translation. It's missed a few of the characters in the title, so things are looking really weird there. But you now kind of have a general subject area idea of what you're looking at. And you can do further searches, say in OCLC now, with a little more confidence. It also will do a search for the text overlaid with the image, basically doing sort of an advanced image search online for what you have. And in this case, it had brought up an example of what it said was basically the same thing, and it was correct. This is another copy of what appears to be the same edition of our book. And so it led us to a website that had this posted. And if I try translating the website, we sort of hit a bit of a dead end. We have someone else who also doesn't know what they're looking at and is asking questions. But sometimes this can result in quite a bit of information, especially if it's a good book. It's likely someone has written pretty extensively on it. And so you can find a remarkable amount of information without having really managed to read a single word in the original language this way. It also works on some of the more difficult alphabets, Arabic alphabets being one of them. This is Urdu, which is something I didn't know when I took this picture. I thought maybe it was Persian, but I was wrong. And Google was right. It was Urdu. And what you do with this information is you just go on to OCLC and you make sure that what it's telling you is correct. You try to find a book that has that title, has that author, is published that date. Rob has a good idea where we check, for example, the pagination in the listing and confirm that it's the same pagination in the book. That way, we can be pretty confident that, yes, a book exists that Google says is this book. So there's a good chance that this information is correct. And again, it can also read handwriting. We're very lucky that this inscription was very neatly written, which makes it much easier for Google to read. And even so, I wouldn't confidently put this translation in my catalog. It doesn't look like that's probably what the author intended to say. There might be a translation problem here. However, I can pretty confidently say that this book was actually transcribed or inscribed by the author. So that's a win, and I didn't have to read a word of it, thank goodness, because I still haven't figured out how to identify where the letters are in Arabic alphabets. So let's say that Google fails you, or you need to more closely confirm what's been asserted by Google Lens, or you just want to sort of get the brain going and sort of figure these things out yourself, or especially if the language is quite obscure. Google still has difficulty, for example, with identifying Mongolian. It cannot figure out Mongolian. There's a couple instances like that. Then you kind of have to do things the old-fashioned way. And the first step is usually figuring out what the language is that you're looking at. The tool that I use most often for that is a website called Omniglot. This is a project run by a single man who has in his life goal to catalog every single language in history. And he does a great job of it. And the thing that makes it very useful to us is that he also includes a lot of information on the writing systems of these languages. And when we're trying to catalog these books, we are not concerned about the language as it's spoken. We're not really concerned about figuring out what the grammar is, the phonology, or anything like that. What we really want to get down is the writing systems. And so this website also has a page, kind of looks like this, has multiple pages, but this is one of them, where it just lists all the alphabets that he has cataloged with some examples of that alphabet, and you can just sort of scroll down and look at your book and say, well, what does this sort of look like? Where can I see glyphs that are showing similarities? And you can sort of start your search from there, and then it becomes a bit of a kind of fun Easter egg hunt, at least in my opinion. But this is a good place to start a lot of the times. The next tool that I use pretty extensively, and I still use this a lot, even when Google Lens is useful, is a website called Lexilogos. Lexilogos basically replaces the need to install a language keyboard in your system in order to write in your the target language. Back in the olden days, that's what you had to do. If you wanted to write in Russian, you had to install a Russian keyboard, and you had to learn how those keys were mapped to a Western keyboard, and it was very difficult. But with Lexilogos, you just sort of pick the language that you want to use, and you get a digital keyboard where you can just type in sort of the English equivalent to the character, and it will give you the character in that language. It also has the characters laid out for you so that if you want to like hunt and peck because you're not sure what that character really represents, you can find it on the screen and click on it, and it will stick it in that little text box there. For a lot of languages, they're sort of based on the Latin alphabet, and so what it will provide you is diacritics, like you see here. This is Pharisee. You can use this as a keyboard replacement, or you can also use it as a way to determine what the language may be. If you see this and you say, well, these are the diacritics that I should expect to see in a text in this language, you can just see that you can check the text. And if there are diacritics that are not here, that are in your book, that is suspicious. That means maybe you're close, but no cigar. It also provides similar keyboards for much more complex and distant from Latin systems. This is Devanagari, which is used in a lot of languages that came from South Asia. And what you can do is you can sort of try to find, like, look for one of these glyphs and see if it's in the text, and if it is, then you're kind of getting close, right? It also very helpfully provides, as you can see, the numerical system, the numbers of the writing system. And if you're gonna really learn any part of the writing system when trying to catalog these books, the numbers are sort of like the best thing to learn, because they will be in the book in sort of a consistent manner. They're very easy to identify because a lot of these books will have pagination, and it'll like be a really quick hint, and they also will provide you a lot of bibliographic information. So they're very good to learn if you're not going to learn anything else. So now I'm just going to go through quickly the sort of thought process and steps for which I use to catalog a book that I cannot read. The first thing to do is determine if you actually want to catalog the book. And there's books from the level of, oh yes, this is very simple, I'll be able to bang it out in 30 minutes, to, oh no, I still can't even figure out what the language is, or the writing system is such a pain in my butt that it will take me a very long time to figure out. And again, what we're concerned with is only the writing system. It's not the complexity of the language itself, because we're not going to be engaged with that. We're only engaged in the writing system. And for that reason, discrete alphabets where the characters are all separated from each other, they tend to be consistently represented in the text, are actually pretty easy to figure out. And those are the ones sort of in my A list here. They're not that hard, especially when you have a large batch of them. It may take you half an hour to do the first book and then 15 minutes to do the next. But once you've kind of gotten the hang of the alphabet, you can type it out pretty fast. And you can actually, I find typing it out in Lexilogos faster than using Google Lens some of the time because of this. But things get more difficult the more complicated the writing system gets. Sometimes glyphs change in context, so you can't easily identify what they are. Sometimes they're closely connected to each other, so you can't tell where one starts and one ends. And that's when sometimes I'll just like stick it in a pile and be like, someday. Like even the most enthusiastic catalogers of these sorts of things have a limit. So the next thing we want to do after we've determined that we are going to catalog the book is to collate the book. And I find that these sorts of books are the most likely to show up on the market where this sort of due diligence hasn't been done. There is sort of a mindset for some people that either the information cannot be found or that it really doesn't matter if a book like this is complete because it's sort of being purchased for sort of novelty's sake and not as a text. But these books are, in fact, texts. It still is important if they are complete, and many times it is possible to determine if they are complete. Pagination, even if you can't read it immediately, again, is 10 characters. So it's worth it to try to figure that part out. And with East Asian books specifically, there are other hints that help you determine the completeness of a book. And I'm just going to divert a little bit from the generalities, and we're going to talk quickly about the specifics of sort of determining completeness in Eastern Asian books, with Japanese books specifically, but a lot of these points also relate to Chinese books and certain Korean books as well. So let's say that you are at a book fair or at a house call and you see a pile of books and they look interesting, but you can't read them. And your primary concern at that moment is, well, is it worth further investigation? Do I think maybe, is it complete or not, for example? One of the easiest ways to do this is if you're lucky enough and the book still has its title label, as you see on this book, very often those books will indicate to you how many volumes are supposed to be in the set. And books like this, stab stitch books, the common format in East Asia, are typically very thin and therefore typically come in multiple volumes. So you have to be careful here. What you want to see if you're seeing a single volume of this book is at the very bottom of the title label, which is where it always is usually a character set apart from the rest of the characters. And if that character looks like this one at the bottom here, that looks like a house, then that means it is one volume complete. This means it's in Japanese, it's Zen, not to be confused with Buddhism. And it just means complete, total, that's it. So if you see that in the volume that you're holding, that's great. That means that's all that there should be, and you don't have to worry. If you see one of these two characters, the one on the left is got a little line above the big line, and the one on the right is got the little line pointing down under the larger line. The first one is upper, and the second one means lower. And this is how volumes are indicated when we're talking about the first or the last volume. And if you see one of these in the wild all by its lonesome, that means it's missing a volume, at least. So if you have two of them together, there's a very good chance that you have a 2-volume set. You have to be a little bit careful with these characters because they are also used for 3-volume sets. So this is a 3-volume set, and you can see again the first leftermost volume has kind of worn away, but it's still there, the character for upper, and in the middle is a character with a line, and then there's a square in the middle of the line. That means middle. And on the right is a character with the line pointing down. That means lower. And this is how, in both Japan and China, at least, these books are indicated to be part of a 3-volume set. Almost always when you have 3 volumes, you should expect an upper, a middle, and a lower character somewhere in the volume. If you see any of these, there needs to be more than just that one volume. After this, when we get to 4 volumes, then they start just using numbers. So that's another good reason to just learn your numbers. There's only 10 of them. And if you see anything besides the Zen little house, then you know that you're thinking of picking up an incomplete set. And there's been more than one time where I've seen, for example, a book that has been cataloged as complete, and the accompanying photo, for example, has like 6 volumes, and it's clear from the item labels that there should be at least 8 volumes. So again, it is possible to collate these books and confirm they're complete, even if you have almost no understanding of the language. So you should definitely do it. The another thing that a lot of these books have is pagination. In Eastern Asian books, Chinese, Japanese, and Korea, very often the pagination is actually foliation, as in there's only one number per leaf, and that number is usually spanning the foredge of the leaf at the fold. It's always pretty much in the same spot. It's always at the bottom, separated from the rest of the text in what is the header for these sorts of formats. So if you look sort of at the bottom, right before the sort of header line, it's pretty much always going to be the leaf number there. It spans the fold, which means that if you sort of pull that gathering open, you will see the complete number, which is what is being shown on the right side there. But if you get kind of used to checking the page numbers of these books, you will probably get used to just being able to recognize the right half of these characters. It happens pretty quick. We have a photographer here at Rulon-Miller Books who came in without knowing any Chinese and very quickly was able to identify what the essentials were for sort of being able to orient yourself around these books. Another good thing to know, if you'll note, there's 2 borders here. We have a top border and a lower border. If you struggle to know which way is up with Eastern books, without having to look at any of the text, if it has borders, there's likely a fatter border and a thinner border, and 99.9 times out of 100, the fatter border is the top of the book, and the lower border is thinner. So that's also a good way to keep yourself from accidentally putting a book upside down in a catalog or something like that. One more bit, a lot of times when we're looking at books, we quickly want to confirm whether we're looking at an earlier printing or later printing or something like that. In Japanese books, typically roughly between, say, 1850 and 1950 or so, the colophons look pretty consistent. And so this is the colophon that you usually will find in the back of the book. This looks very scary if you don't know any Japanese. And this is very specific to Japanese. Chinese books and Korean books do something similar to this, but not exactly the same, I don't think. So I'm really speaking only to Japanese books here because I can't be confident about claiming the same thing for other countries' bibliographic history. But typically what the Japanese will do is provide the printing history in the colophon of the book. And what you're looking for is a couple of lines of text, usually more than one, because in this case we have a date of printing and then the date of publishing, the release date. And all of the text will kind of look the same. If you've memorized your numbers, you'll see it's full of numbers because it's mostly dates. And what you want is no more than 2 lines. Now, let's say you're looking at this and going, this is impossible. I cannot tell what line is what on these pages. Have no fear. You may not be able to tell if you're looking at a first printing, but it becomes a little easier when you're looking at a later printing. So this is another case where you may not be confident in what a thing is, but you may become more confident in what a thing isn't. So here is cases, and you can see typically the printing history is put on the top right of the page, like you see here, and it's just like a series of numbers. You can tell the text is relatively the same, but you see it's a sequence of some sort, and that's because these are notes on the printings and the dates of those printings. Right? So now we know that this is a later printing, and maybe we don't want to bother with it as much as we did previously. The next part. So do not trust, only verify is the motto of the illiterate cataloger. I've had some really egregious situations show up, and we cannot blame the booksellers who end up in these situations. Most of the time what happens is they take a book on faith, they're told something about it, and they simply relay that information to the next person. These are typically very good booksellers who maybe trusted a little too much. And one example of that is very early on in my career. I was working for Rob, and he puts a Japanese book in front of me, and he says, go ahead and catalog this. So, of course, the first thing I did was collate it. And what I discovered very quickly is that using the system that I just showed you, there were page numbers. And so I just counted the page numbers. Very simple situation. Except in this case, the page just kept skipping. It was going 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, 15, 17, and so on, until after I got to the end of it, I realized that an entire half of the book had been excised. And there were a lot of illustrations in this book, and those are the sorts of books that are victimized in this way. So we had half a book. And the dealer was a reputable dealer. He was a good and upstanding guy and took the book back. Who knows if he was able to get his money back, but it's a problem. So be very careful, not just in terms of not wanting to put out a book that you might accidentally misrepresent, but just be very careful about by no intentional malice on the part of the seller that you don't buy something that is really problematic. This is another case of such a situation. We got this in a collection of a guy who was not very discerning about what he bought. He liked buying books that were sort of interesting and novel and had cool scripts in them. So very relevant to our interests, but sometimes there are problems. And palm leaf manuscripts like this are really vulnerable to this sort of thing. At some point there was a bad actor, but many times when it gets to you, you don't know who that bad actor was. There are probably many, many links in the chain back. And so this is a palm leaf manuscript, pretty difficult to catalog. One of those things where maybe we might just say, we're not going to be able to get very deep in this. We might say that it's palm leaf book. We might be able to estimate a date. We might be able to use Google Lens to identify the actual language, but Google Lens can't give you a full text translation of this. I tried, it could not do it. But before we even decide that we're going to invest more time to figure this out, we just have to sort of put on, our basic bibliographic sleuthing caps and decide whether or not it's worth it. And there are a lot of elements about this book that are red flags that tell us there's probably not even worth it to try cataloging it. For example, you can see here, one of the palm leaves is a significantly different size than the rest of them. It's just much thinner and it's a little narrower. And the leaves themselves are all sort of different colors, which is strange because you would think if they were all kept together, they would be discolored in the same way. So that's odd. If we look more closely, you may see sort of the most obvious problem here, but even without that, we can tell that these were probably not written in the same hand. If we look for individual characters within each leaf, we can kind of sense that maybe they're not in the same orientation. It might be because I'm holding the thing wrong, so we have to be somewhat careful about that. But typically we would expect that if someone is reading this book and they're flipping through it, they'll be able to see everything sort of upright as they flip through it. So if things look like one character is going up in one leaf and going down in the other leaf, that's usually not a great sign. But of course, the biggest problem here is with the sewing. Someone has gone through and ignored these sewing holes completely and just pierced through the text of this book to rebind it. And you can tell the lower leaf has sewing holes that are wider than the holes on the upper two leaves, which suggest that it was intended to be bound in a completely different volume, right? Because they're going to create the holes and then they're going to write around it. And it's expected to be consistent. So what we have here, before we even start worrying about if this is something we want to really invest our time in, is a Franken book. It's a severely sophisticated product. And palm leaf manuscripts are very vulnerable to this because they are easy to disbound and rebind, and people don't treat them as texts. So I think it's not wrong to think of them as really interesting as objects, because they are very interesting as objects, and there is a market for them as objects. But I think we want to be a little careful about making sure that we still respect them as books and understand that for a lot of the people who care about these, they are books. That means they're text, and a mess like this is sort of not really something that we would want to sell as a book, only as sort of a demonstration of how badly things can go awry. So we also want to make sure that we are not trusting anything people say about this, right? We need to use our own eyes. But sometimes being very distrustful and insisting on verification can be very beneficial. It can open up avenues of inquiry and opportunity that would otherwise not exist. It's a value-added skill set to be suspicious. So this is an example of a book that we received with another group of Latin and Greek books. We got a small collection of them, and this was in there. And the bookseller we received them from was a very good bookseller. Most of his cataloging was excellent, and we relied on it pretty heavily when cataloging most of the books that we received from him. This one was a bit of a weirdo because it lacked a title page. Its boards were off. It was kind of waterlogged and charred. It was a complete mess, and it was described effectively as a Bible in Greek. And that was it. So one of my coworkers cataloged it as such, and I looked at it and I said, well, that's not quite enough. Let's figure out what this actually is, right? And so all I did, and this is the thing, like, verifying is not always a painful process. It can be quite simple sometimes. What I did was I typed in the Greek-looking text into Google, and I did a search, and immediately the results came up not as Greek, but as Karamanli Turkish. And Karamanli Turkish is a minority language. It is spoken by the Karamanli Turks, who were Turkish Christians and used Greek as their writing system up until they sort of converted to using the Latin alphabet. They ended up sort of being forced to relocate from Turkey to Greece during a planned population exchange. And so they've been through a lot. And once I found all that out, it was kind of easy to recontextualize this book and make it sound a lot more interesting than a charred and waterlogged Bible in Greek. And Bibles also are very great to catalog if you can't read them, because the texts tend to be online completely because people are trying to fossilize, right? So that these texts tend to be sometimes some of the very few full texts in the rarer languages that are easy to access. And a lot of people are interested in them. So there's a lot of research done on them. There's a good bibliography on them, Darlow and Mule. And if you look in, for example, the Bible Society histories and all their newsletters and things like that, you'll find quite a bit about these books without having to do all that much work, as long as you know what the language is. And you can find out what the language is relatively easy nowadays because of the technology that's available. So I was able to find out that, there was a pretty fraught publishing history for trying to get the Bible translated into Karamanli, and that there were very few copies available in any edition, and there were no copies that I could find of this particular edition. So it became a pretty interesting book that we sold pretty quickly. So we're going to change gears pretty quickly, and we're going to talk a little bit about once we kind of know what the book is, once we have an idea, once we've sort of figured out the title, author, and so on and so forth, is what we do to actually catalog the book. And the only thing that I really want to note here is in terms of how we represent the title page specifically. And some of this can translate into your description as well, but like, how do we translate or represent foreign language material in our cataloging? There are a number of problems with this, mostly related to how modern technology interacts with non-English languages. But the solution that we use effectively is that we represent the title in 3 different ways. The first way is that we use the native language to closely transcribe the title. So to transcribe it as it's written on the title page in the book, actually adhering to the sort of bibliographic standards you would expect if it were an English book. Now we do this because we assume that the people who want to read this book can read the book. And if they can read the book, they are probably looking for the book in their native language, and they can probably search via that native language. So we want to make the book available to people who do know the language. The second thing we do is we transcribe the title phonetically. And we do this without using any diacritic marks whatsoever. And the reason for that is because when we list them on the sites that we list at in America, which is typically like A-Books, Biblio, eBay, and so on and so forth, those platforms do a really terrible job of representing any character that isn't in standard American English. Not even the accent aigu is safe from the machine with A-Books and so on and so forth. So if you look at the bottom of the screen there, you'll see what happens when you put Russian into A-Books. It doesn't survive. We use, for example, OCLC. Often their cataloging provides transliterations for foreign language books, which is very useful, but we often see that there are diacritic marks added to those transliterations, which is appropriate when correctly representing alphabets that don't, match one-to-one with the English alphabet, and most of them don't, but doesn't work when what we're trying to do is make it machine friendly. So we strip any diacritics that OCLC may add to their transliteration when we add it to the title page. And the last thing we do is we provide an English translation. A lot of books will already have an English translation provided somewhere. Once you know what it is, there's maybe an English title that's there, or if there are a few copies already cataloged, someone has come up with the translation and other people are just using it. I find it's best to go with the herd there, so that effectively your copy comes up along with those other copies. In cases where there is no certain translation, there's no copies available that represent an English title, then you just have to do your best, make a fluent English translation that does not make any overwhelming assumptions about what the title may be. And I also find that it helps to sort of spot, translate pieces of the title, because things like proper nouns and topic-specific terms can sometimes get lost in translation. So sometimes you want to translate a single word that maybe you think maybe has a different context in English, and that will help you make a more accurate translation for your title. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit of pricing, a little bit about markets. So most of these books, well, a lot of them at least, you may not even find a single copy of them listed online in the American platforms. But that doesn't mean they're not actually for sale or that there's no market for them. most of them have native markets. There's a Russian book market, there's a Chinese book market, there's a Japanese book market, and so on. And by going to the source of those markets, you can find more information. So the way that I do this is that, like, let's say I go to Google Translate, and in the English section, I will look up used book, rare book sales, and things like that, and I will translate it into the target language. And using that translation, I will do a search for that term, and what comes up is often the website that people who speak the language use to find and buy their books. And what this will do is give you, firstly, a much more accurate sense of the scarcity of the book in the market. It can also give you some idea of price. There's clearly a very strong barrier between, say, the Japanese prices and the American prices. I had a pretty embarrassing moment early on in my career, which I still think about when I go to sleep at night sometimes, where I went up to a dealer in the New York Book Fair and told him I could buy the books that he had listed for $1,000 for $100 in Japan. And he very politely said, well, I think you should do that then. Because I didn't really understand at the time the difficulty of importation or dealing with a dealer who doesn't speak your language and so on and so forth. And of course, he sold those books, and I learned a lesson that day. But so the prices may not be as useful to you, but sometimes when you see something with a really high price, that may say something to you. And sometimes the Russians do this well. The Japanese are notoriously bad at it. These booksellers will also provide the context. They will do just what we do here in America and try to sell the book with a blurb or a hook or something like that. And it will tell you why the book in your hand is of any interest to anyone. And it can be difficult to find that if you're looking only for American or English language sources. So that's basically the slew of tips and tricks that I use when I'm cataloging books that I can't read. Generally, it's the same as books that I can, except I have to be much more careful about bad information. I should also note that if there's anything written in English in the book that you're trying to catalog, do not trust that either. I've seen lots of assertions that are very incorrect. Everything from the language being wrong in the book, from the author, the source of the book, the topic of the book, all wrong many times over. So you have to be a lot more suspicious, and you have to be a little bit more willing to eat crow. You have to be willing to guess a little bit more. But if you're willing to take the risks and if you're willing to invest the time, there isn't that much more effort sometimes than you might think. And the information is much more easy to find than you might think, now that there are a lot of tools for being able to bridge the language barrier. So that's it. That's all I got.
Thanks, Maria. That was great. Lizzie here.
Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
I actually have a quick question. You talked about funny business story about, do you have like a really good, like, bookseller story about dealing with people that are trying to sell one thing that may be another?
Facsimiles are a very big problem for this. Actually, this is not my story. This is Alex Aiken's story. Alex is Valerium, and he is a sinologist. He knows his Chinese, right? And there is a big problem with facsimiles of, for example, communist posters. So a lot of times people will not be certain about whether or not a communist poster is genuine or a facsimile, and they'll simply say that it's genuine without having really been able to confirm that whatsoever. And the response may or may not be positive if they're corrected. So, things like that show up. Facsimiles are problematic. And especially with Chinese and Japanese books, people aren't sure of what an old book looks like. So a lot of times questions about the date of printing can be a little bit contentious.
Right. We've got a question. Do you have particular favorite sales sites that deal with Attic Greek for researching prices?
Well, that's very specific. No, there are definitely lots of European sales platforms, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. And usually I have to sort of retrace my steps and go through the process of finding them all over again when I find a book in Greek and so forth.
Like Eurobook, but for classical antiquity.
The thing with sort of the markets are location-based markets, right? So we're not so much looking for websites that are specific about Greek antiquity or so forth, but we're looking for markets for people who speak Greek now. So if you can find, for example, the Greek website that all the Greek people go to buy their Greek books, then you might find something there. But subject-specific platforms, I'm not sure I know many of those.
What would your Google search be if you were looking for something like that? Like what kind of English language would you put in to find like?
Yeah, I would sort of look for like antiquarian books or classic books. Sales is a very good word to use there.
Sales,
and then
okay.
I would translate it into Greek, and I would search in Greek. If you know Greek, then you can just do it straight that way. But what I'm looking for is sort of the modern Greek markets. It's like, for example, if I'm looking for Japanese books, I wouldn't look for like very specific genres of Japanese books. I would just be looking for used books in the Japanese, using the Japanese term for that to look for it.
Right. Is there any kind of like, so you talked about wild guesses, and I think we, not that we ever want to say we're doing that because of course we're professional, but I picked up something in the middle of the country that was in Danish from like the mid 18th century. And at first I thought it was German until I showed it to somebody. Like, is there any kind of, do you ever put anything like that in your description that like hedging your bet kind of?
Yeah. Yeah, so for example, the book that's the Caramelli book, I couldn't determine the exact edition. There were many editions out there. All of them the typography was slightly incorrect for our edition. The history that I had read on Caramelli suggested to me that this was possibly the first edition published. But there was no way of me really to be able to say that. The title page had been ripped completely out along with all of the preliminaries. It was just a disaster of a book in terms of its condition. And so I did say, I just explained my thought process in the cataloging. I said, we found these copies. They were not the exact same. According to the history that I read, there was a prior edition. And it is possible that this is the one, but without any text to make a close comparison, we cannot say for certain. And so that's how I made my case about.
So you feel comfortable doing that? You feel comfortable like putting that in there? That's good to know. Scott Brown asks, do you use a stylus to copy Japanese, Chinese, Arabic into Google Translate when Lens doesn't recognize the characters?
I don't use a stylus. Because I deal in a lot of Japanese and Chinese books, I do have the Japanese keyboard installed, and there is a function in that keyboard where it gives you a little white square and you can draw the character in with your mouse. And that is what I use. And once again, I can't read any Chinese and I can read Japanese very barely. But if you really want to deal in this material, the writing system for both is very systematized. So you don't need to recognize the character or read the character to understand the process of writing the character. And once you get that down, you can sort of just use that tool and the character will come up very reliably. And that's how I tend to do it. There's also websites that will allow you to do it online if you don't want to install the keyboard.
Oh, do you have any suggestions? Do you know what the names of those are? Or?
So I would not suggest Jisho, which is the Japanese website for it. Its recognition system is not great. There's let's see if I can find it. There's a Chinese version. I always just Google search it again. Let's see. I cannot pronounce the Chinese term for the characters. It's Hanzi, I think. And if you just search HANZI recognition, there's a website called Q Hanzi, HANZI, and that is a website where you can just sort of write in the character, and that recognizes Chinese characters specifically. There's a lot of overlap, so you can use tools for Chinese and Japanese for either language for most characters, but sometimes it doesn't quite work.
Sounds good. Just looking for any more questions. No more questions here. That was fantastic. Thank you. It's it's such a, it's exciting to look at other languages, and I get really excited, especially with manuscripts, but then I have that sinking moment where I'm like, well, how am I going to do this?
Yeah, I think you have to be willing to accidentally put your foot in your mouth more often with these sorts of books than with English material. And I think some people, they want to present themselves as the expert, and that's difficult to do
Right.
with these. Whereas I am willing to say, well, this is what I think it is. Maybe someone who knows better will come by and get themselves a good score for these
Right.
books. But you shouldn't be too afraid of taking that risk, in my opinion.
Right. I actually reached out to my local university here, University of Rhode Island. I needed to get a German translation, and they had a master's program. And I actually ended up with somebody fantastic who was able to do German and quite a few other languages. And so it didn't even occur to me to do that, so that, if you're in another area, just maybe going to a local university and seeing if they have a master's program, because they're always looking for extra work. So, yeah.
We did that with the North Korean archive. We had a student who did a very, very good job for us.
Oh, that's great.
And with expensive material, it makes sense to do it right and get someone who really knows what's going on. A lot of the books I catalog, they end up being $150 books. We don't want to spend $150 to translate them, but
right. But yeah, especially if it's a manuscript, a one-of-a-kind thing, sometimes it is worth it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for stepping in.
I think Scott Brown has a question. Another question.
Can you
question.
hear me? I was going to ask the question.
Go for it.
So if you're cataloging, a 19th century Japanese book, in your cataloging, do you use the title as written, or do you use the modern version if the characters have been updated?
I use the title as written. It causes, there's arguments for both, because, for example, a lot of times the cataloging that's been done in, for example, there's a Japanese version of OCLC effectively, and a lot of times they will modernize the characters, or sometimes they don't, and it's sort of problematic. A lot of times searches will understand that the characters are the same, and so either one you choose, if you go into for example, their union catalog, it will catch both, which is good. But we use the characters as written. We just sort of follow best academic bibliographic practices in that sense, and then we just use the transliteration that sort of covers the rest of it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, another successful Wednesday. Do you have anything to finish off there, Maria?
No, I think we're all good. Hopefully I'll see a lot of interesting books from everyone soon.
Yes, thank
Pull
you.
those books you can't read out of your closet.
That have been sitting there for years, and you just keep looking at it going, yeah. Thanks a lot.